The topic of tonight's talk is something which I was asked from last week, and I was sent a message if it's possible to dedicate a lecture or bulk of the lecture to this topic. It's something it could be very controversial. It's a particular area in science which could be used to be able to help people, but at the same time, there are many ethical and moral issues associated with it. And this is something called PGD. It has a few names: PGD, PGS, PGDIS, and basically it's all different types of forms of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or screening. And basically it's a method where through IVF we're able to diagnose a genetic disease or abnormal chromosomes. And the way it is done is that there has to be, first of all, IVF. So you have to do the process which we discussed last week, when the eggs are removed from the wife and the sperm from the husband. The eggs are inseminated by the sperm, but before you transfer the embryo into the uterus, at a certain point, and there are different methods and different types of policies and philosophies exactly at which point you would do that, but at a certain point you biopsy a blastomere, which means like a cell from each embryo, and you check them for any kinds of mutations for genetic diseases, and then you're able to choose which embryo you transfer. And by doing that, you're eliminating sometimes sicknesses and genetic deficiencies and mutations. Now, there are certain areas which are black and white, that it seems to be very much in order to use that method. Before we talk about that, I'll discuss something which I touched upon in one of my lectures. It's concerning an organization called Dor Yeshorim. Dor Yeshorim is a organization that existed since I think 1983. We're talking about close to 40 years. And they developed a method and a philosophy guided by doctors and halachic authorities of how to be able to, before a couple even meets on a date, to be able to detect if there are any recessive incompatibilities. In other words, there are two types of genetic problems. One is called dominant. Dominant means that it dominates. A person who has a particular deficiency, he is affected by it. And there's something called a recessive genetic problem, which means that a person can have something in the background behind the scenes. He can live a full life and he will never be affected by it. It could be a recessive gene for some very deadly and fatal, debilitating diseases, and a person will never know about it, unless this person will marry a young lady who has exactly the same recessive gene for the same genetic problem. And if they get married with each other, it becomes already not a recessive problem, but it will affect statistically 1 out of 4 kids. So we're talking about 25% of kids will be born and affected by this fatal, sometimes debilitating and terminal, very often terminal disease that is obviously very traumatic. And specifically in every different communities, they have predispositions to certain sicknesses. We Jewish people have certain sicknesses that are almost endemically in our communities, and you don't find them in other communities. Some of them specifically in Ashkenazi communities. With Jewish people, we are Ashkenazi Jews. They come from Germany, and from Germany they sort of went to Eastern Europe, to Russia and Poland and Ukraine and all these places. They're called Ashkenazi Jews, and as opposed to Sephardi Jews that come from Spain, and from Spain they went to North Africa, to Turkey, to Syria, and to all these places. So you have certain types of particular genetic issues with both Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, but specifically with Ashkenazi Jews, for whatever reason, we have quite a number of them that are quite common. And Dar Yisharim was created in order to be able to address that problem and to avoid terrible traumas. If people meet and fall in love, it's already not fair to be able to put them in this situation and afterwards to discover that they both have this recessive gene. So the idea is to be able to screen, every single boy and every single girl in the Jewish communities, in the religious communities. They send the sample. Today it's a genetic sample, which is today it's saliva. Once upon a time was blood. Today it's saliva. They send it to the organization. Everybody has a number. Before a boy and a girl go out on a date, on the first date, they call in, or the parents call in with the particular number, and say this is the birth year and the number, and they get an answer. Yeah, it's a match. Sometimes they will be told it's not a match. But the underlying philosophy behind this organization is, number one, the only test for recessive incompatibilities. Because if they will start testing people for dominant ones, you're basically taking away the chances to get married. Once a person finds out that he has a particular, and this organization doesn't want to play God. They want to be able to create a situation where people who are not compatible genetically shouldn't get married, shouldn't meet in the first place. And the second thing is that they don't identify the particular sickness. So let's say, for example, one particular, a boy has a recessive gene for Tay-Sex. Tay-Sex is you can look it up, it's a very, very terrible disease. Again, if it's recessive, it's not going to affect you. And the girl doesn't have it. So all they will tell you is it's a match. They're not going to say, look, you had the recessive gene for Tay-Sex, she didn't have it, go out. No, they will say it's a match and that's it. Nobody has to know. And I think it's a very, very clever and wise way to operate, because it avoids many problems. I'll tell you, here in Sydney, they, I don't know if it still exists, but they used to screen in Walper Hospital, they used to advertise for young Jewish boys and girls to come and to get screened, and they would give them the whole diagnosis. And at that time, we're talking about back in the, probably in the either late 90s or early 21st century. I remember that we had just because of the school, it was sort of organized through the school together with the Walper Hospital, and my oldest two daughters were tested. It was different to Dar Yisharim. They were tested by Walper Hospital, and they get a whole page saying, okay, and Baruch Hashem, thank God, they came out with 0. Why it's Baruch Hashem? Because if they would come out with any sort of deficiencies, it's not anymore like in a Dar Yisharim where nobody knows about it and you can just know that it's a match and everything's fine. Over here, you have to declare it. And once you have to declare it, it becomes already a certain, it leads to certain problems. And what inevitably would happen if all these different countries would test for these genetic issues, and they would know what they have, and afterwards, in order to solve the problem, they would go to Dar Yisharim. Dar Yisharim would be flooded with recessive genetic problems. So I came to the conclusion a long time ago that the wisest way to go about it is through Dar Yisharim, because it's something which doesn't advertise or declare a particular problem, but it just tells you it's a match or no match. So that's the underlying philosophy. Number one, non-dominant checks, and number two, only recessive match or not match. So they test for things like Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, Canavan disease, SMA, Lee syndrome. All of these things are very, very serious sicknesses if both partners possess them, and they know in advance not to go out to avoid these problems. Now, I remember one time, it was a number of years ago, I received a call from a young man in America who told me the following situation. He asked for my advice of my rabbinic ruling, I suppose. He said to me like this, that he was a boy from a religious family, and he started to go out with a girl from a religious family. They weren't introduced, they just met. And he asked her out, and nobody told them. Usually when the parents assist in introductions, they are experienced and they know about Dar Yisharim. And they would make sure that before a couple goes out, they will be checked. But in this case, they didn't ask the parents. The parents probably didn't even know they're going out. And they started to go out, and they went out for a long time, especially for religious circles when we don't go out for years before we get married. And they decided to get engaged. Once they decided to get engaged, and they told the parents we're getting engaged, they were told by people around them, you have to check before you get engaged for the Dar Yisharim. I'm talking about a couple who already went out probably for a year. They already developed feelings to each other and so on and so forth. And sure enough, they were both carriers, recessive carriers of cystic fibrosis, which is potentially a very, very debilitating sickness, could result in terrible lung problems. Sometimes even people need lung transplant. Sometimes they get a bacteria which they will not be able to get rid of. They have to go to hospitals. It's quite a very, very traumatic sickness, potentially. And so if it's already post factum, in other words, a couple, let's say a married couple, discover that they have a particular genetic problem, that's when you have the benefits of PGD. You can say, look, we're not going to have children through naturally, we're going to go on birth control, and only when the only way to have kids is through IVF, and we'll test each embryo for the genetic component for any problem, and only transfer healthy embryos. So that's something which PGD could be legitimately used for. Again, if the couple didn't go out yet, it makes sense for them not to go out and to go, into the life with that sort of package, with this sort of issues and problems. That the only way they can have kids is through IVF. But we're talking about a couple that already sort of develop feelings for each other and they want to get married. So he asked my opinion, what I think about it. His parents are very much against it, because he could marry anybody that he wants, and she could marry anybody that she wants, and they would have perfectly healthy kids. But together, they can only have kids through IVF. So I said to him, do you love this girl? He said, very much so. I said, well, maybe you shouldn't marry her then, because if you love her, you really are sentencing her to a very difficult life. Because, the only way to be able to have kids, I think IVF is a very, very stressful sort of road to take. And so I spoke to him. I said to him, it's physically, mentally, financially. Financially, it's also, in a way, could be more expensive than the regular IVF, because you're limited with which embryos you're able to transfer, because you have a certain, statistically, a quarter of the embryos will not be healthy. Anyway, so he said, look, I hear what you're saying. So what you're saying is, he told me that if I love the girl, I shouldn't marry her. I said, yeah, you should consider not marrying her. So he said, look, he's going to think about it. He's going to give me a call. He called me back, and he says, look, I spoke to the young lady, and she also thought about it. She spoke to other people who had to go through IVF PGD, and she says that now that it's already happened, we already sort of developed a relationship, she wants to go through it. So I'm asking you the question differently, he says. I'm asking you not whether you're advising me to do it or not. Halachically, am I allowed to do it? Can we start our life knowing that we're going to only have children through IVF PGD? So I said to him, look, I have to be honest with you. I can't tell you that it's forbidden. It's not advisable, but it's not, just like a couple who's already married and a couple that discovers they have a genetic problem. We don't tell them, God forbid, to get divorced. That's part of life's challenges. So the same way here, if you already developed feelings for each other and you feel that you, knowing all the facts, knowing all the difficulties, you still want to go through it, I can't tell you that it's forbidden. But all I can tell you is that it's a very, in other words, the only way that you're allowed to go through IVF, as I mentioned last week, is only if you will, every step of the way has to be halachically guided. Starting from which form of birth control is allowed by Jewish law, which is a different subject. There's some forms of birth control which are permitted and some which are not permitted, because obviously since they're only going to have kids through IVF, any other time when it's not IVF, they have to use birth control. And IVF itself, as I mentioned before, I only mentioned one particular aspect in detail, the aspect of hashgacha, to be able to only go through a clinic that allows for the protocol and to have the guidance every step of the way, because the halachic questions come every step of the way. So afterwards, I received a call from his father, and his father said to me, Rabbi Ulman, you must tell my son that he can't do it. You shouldn't let him get married to this girl. He can get married to anybody he wants, and she could marry to whoever she wants, and they won't have to go through it. I said to him, look, if he's asking me for a halachic question, I cannot lie to him. I've given him my advice. I told him that, perhaps from a logical perspective, it makes sense for both of them to find somebody else. But ultimately, if they've proven the commitment and they want to get married to each other, I can only tell them what the law says, and the law doesn't prohibit it. It's not a black and white case when the law, certain things are not allowed. We mentioned this, we spoke about certain things. But this is not something which you can say that it's a black and white. So the father says, look, I'm a poor teacher, and he's going to expect me to help him. I can't afford to be able to pay for his IVF. I said, listen, you can tell him from the very beginning that you are limited financially, and therefore, you are. He's not to expect that you should cover all the costs. That's fine. You can do what you can do. So he asked me, so what do you think I should do as a father? So I said to him, listen, as a father, you have the right until they get engaged. You have a right to talk him out of it, to be able to speak to him and to see if, and talking out of it in a way tests their resolve, how much they're really committed to each other. But the minute they get engaged, you have to support him as a father supports a son. After all, he's marrying a Jewish girl, is not going against the law, and you have to attend the wedding because the parents, in the beginning, they actually threatened to boycott the wedding if it goes through. So you have to go to the wedding, and you have to be able to support your children. So that's something which is an example how PGD would affect one's life once you discovered certain genetic incompatibilities after you engage to get married. Before that, you can avoid it through Derech Shalom. Derech Shalom doesn't avoid everything, as I said before. It doesn't avoid dominant problems. And over here, I'm going to come to the question of 3 levels of PGD. When is it completely not supported by Jewish law? It's something which Jewish law doesn't really approve at all. Another example is when the Jewish law would approve, and then you have certain gray area. So let's talk first about where the Jewish law would approve such a, to go through IVF PGD. And that's simple. The simplest case is when it's done for health reasons. So if a couple, for example, discovered that they have, that one of them has a dominant genetic problem after they get married, it's something which we don't discover until we get married, then sometimes if the sickness is very serious and life-threatening or fatal or debilitating, then the couple not only is allowed to, but they're advised to only have children through IVF. So sometimes you have, for example, like X-related problems. So, X-related problem is a particular dominant situation. I won't go into it right now. It's fragile X and these type of things. It specifically affects males more than affects females. So the females they'll be carriers, but it won't show up in them so much. But X-related problems are very difficult, and sometimes you either have to eliminate them or at least choose the right gender to be able to, for health reasons. So complicated medical issues, they allow for PGD. What about very frivolous things? People look for every small deficiencies. They go crazy. People, they have all kinds of mishigasan, as we say. So people, they go to every single possible genetic testing, and they want to create a perfect child without any problems. Now, first of all, Judaism is not about creating this perfect race, blonde hair and blue eyes, and say that we want to have perfect people. It's not what Yiddishkeit is all about. As a matter of fact, I believe very strongly that when people try too hard, you'll never be able to bavoren, to forewarn every problem. And people who try too hard, they'll find very, very soon that they think they eliminate one problem and they cause many other problems. So people look at it very frivolously. And they think they're going to help the situation by having perfect kids with every small little issue that you have. You have to be able to differentiate between serious problems that affect life, or even fatal, or debilitating, and things that are frivolous. When people want to create, to take every single imperfection out, potentially that's what PGD is. PGD could be very dangerous if you use it for that particular purpose. And that's something which Yiddishkeit wouldn't approve. Another example is when people use it purely for gender selection. In other words, the couple want to be able to have only boys or only girls. Or they want to be able to have boy, boy, girl, girl, boy, boy. They want to be able to plan the family. That's something which is not allowed in Jewish law, to be able to start planning the family through PGD. I'm talking about a situation when a couple can have children naturally and they want to have IVF PGD only in order to be able to choose a gender. I had a call, this happened not more than a year ago. I get a call from a rabbi in Los Angeles, and he says, I have a congregant who needs help with IVF, and I've sent them to you, because you know, that's what the rabbis do, they send these cases to me. So the guy calls me up as an Israeli gentleman, and he's about 49 years old. He has a wife who is, I think she was something like 42 years old. And they have 2 daughters, and they want to have a son. So he calls me up and he says, Rabbi Ulman, I want to have IVF so we can have gender selection, and I know that IVF requires halachic guidance, halachic also sanction. So I'd like you to give him permission to do it and also to be able to guide me. So I said to him, I want to tell you something. So what are you planning to do? So let's say you go through IVF and you only will find that you only have girls. So, well, I'm not going to use it. I said, look, I'm sorry, I can't give you a sanction to go through IVF. He says, what do you mean? But I want to have a boy. I said to him, IVF doesn't justify to be able to go through it just to have gender selection. And I said to him as follows. I said to him, look, under normal circumstances, if your wife would have been younger, I wouldn't let her do it altogether. In other words, it's not justified. Even if a couple, in Jewish law, there's a mitzvah called Prurevu. First mitzvah in the Torah, be fruitful and multiply. Not everybody can fulfill this mitzvah. It's a mitzvah, but obviously it depends on God. And it says that in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you have to have, as a minimum, a boy and a girl. So if a person has, let's say, 7 boys, okay, he did a fantastic job. He helped to populate the earth, and he helped the Jewish people to be able to gain numbers, but he hasn't technically fulfilled the mitzvah. Is it his fault? No. Is he going to be somehow judged for it? God forbid. This is something which comes from God. Does that justify, in order to fulfill the mitzvah, to do PGD? No, it's not. I mean, there are certain exceptional situations when somebody will really go, has a mental, will go into depression, have a mental illness, unless they're going to have a particular child and so on and so forth. I won't discuss those rare cases. Obviously, we do look at every case individually. But normally, just because a person says, look, I have 7 boys, I want to have a girl, or vice versa, I have 7 girls, I want to have a boy, that doesn't justify to go through IVF PGD. You have to do what you can. There are certain natural ways that the rabbis in the Talmud tell us how to be able to affect the gender, and it's something that lately was also supported by scientists. We've spoken about already in the Talmud many 2,000 years ago. But to go through IVF, why not? So first of all, as I mentioned to you last week, IVF is not it's not a mitzvah. IVF is a heter, it's permitted. In other words, there's no obligation on a couple. Even if the couple cannot have children, there's no obligation on them to do IVF. Hashem demands of each person to do what's natural for him. At the same time, as I mentioned last time, the halachic authorities and the halacha Jewish law, which has a system, which I'll hopefully explain soon. I want to give some kind of a separate lesson to explain the structure of halacha, structure of Jewish law. So the halacha does very much, the halacha is very sensitive to human emotions. And halacha, the Torah understands how painful it is for a couple not to have children. And therefore, under very, very particular guidelines, it allows for IVF to take place. But it's not simple. There are many, many questions which I haven't even discussed with you, which make it a very, very sort of something which you do as a last resort, not in the first place. And as a result of it, there's sometimes it's not justified to go through IVF in order to be able to achieve certain goal. And having, even when a couple say, look, we would like to have a child from a particular gender in order to fulfill the mitzvah, it's not justified. So, but I told this particular gentleman that in his case, I would allow them to go through IVF, because statistically, after a certain age, the percentages to have a child who is afflicted with Down syndrome and certain other chromosomal problems go significantly higher. So when a woman becomes already late 30s, especially in the 40s, and especially after, when she already reaches, every year after she becomes 40, the chances are much greater. And for that reason itself is sometimes justified, because the possibility of having a Down syndrome child is very much higher statistically. So for that reason, we would allow them to go through IVF. So I said to this Israeli guy that if your wife would have been 35 years old, I would tell you that it's out of the question altogether to be able to go through IVF. But if you want to have more kids, I would let you go through IVF PGD, but we'll have to write a contract. And the contract is signed by you, by me, and by the Hashgacha agency, the supervising agency that will supervise the process, as I mentioned to you last time, has to be done under supervision. So we've signed a contract. I forgot to bring it to you. It would have been interesting to read it, but I'll give you a gist of it. What we signed with him was as follows. We signed a few scenarios. If he has embryos that are both male and female, then he's allowed to, because you have to transfer one of them anyway. So nobody says you must put a boy or a girl. You can do whatever you want. Once you can put the male one first if you want. If it works, and works doesn't just mean she becomes pregnant, it means a successful birth. Now the child is born. Then there's no obligation to be able to transfer all the other ones. Generally speaking, according to Halacha, there's no obligation. Once, let's say, for example, the couple produced many embryos, and they had all the kids they want to have, there's no obligation to continue and to do frozen transfers to transfer all of them. They could be disposed of under Hashgacha, under supervision. So that's if you are successful. If you're not successful and she doesn't become pregnant, then you can keep on putting them, but you cannot stop putting them because only females are left. You must, and if it comes to a point that either there's only female embryos, then you must put female embryos until she becomes pregnant or until they're all unsuccessful. And if you have a couple of male and a few female, and you tried the male once and it didn't work, then you can't just say, look, I've tried the males, forget about the females. You cannot use PGD for gender selection. That's something which we wouldn't allow. In Australia, by the way, it's illegal. Even the civil law in America, it's much more, they're much more liberal about it. In Australia, they would not let you do IVF for the purpose of gender selection. I'm not going to go into, by the way, into the question of something very modern of how to do gender selection through IUI without testing embryos, just testing sperms. That's something for a different time, but I wouldn't allow this just for gender selection either, by the way. IUI means artificial insemination or the intrauterine insemination. That also wouldn't be justified, even though it's a much simpler process than IVF, but I still wouldn't justify doing it. I want to finish off and then we'll have questions. I want to finish off with a gray area. Which is not so black and white. There are certain sicknesses that may not be debilitating, but may cause certain discomfort to the children. And then and I'm faced with these questions very often. I'm dealing with the question right now in America with the following question. There's no black and white answer. The Jewish law doesn't say you must do either, you must go through PGD or you must have the children naturally. A lot depends on many factors to do with the emotions of parents and so on and so forth, and the level of discomfort for the kids. But sometimes, look, we know that all of us have challenges in health. Nobody is perfectly healthy, right? And therefore, it's not always either a mitzvah, an obligation, or even praiseworthy to try to forewarn every single medical issue that may come up. But sometimes it's a real dilemma. For example, I'm dealing now with a case of a certain muscular deficiency, which could potentially, it's not positive, people could live with it, and it's something which the father has. And the father is having quite a good life. He feels it sometimes. Sometimes it's difficult for him to walk up the steps, and sometimes it could be noticeable that his walk is not as brisk and as natural as with some other people. But nevertheless, he's quite happy that he was born, and that his birth wasn't eliminated because his parents decided to limit the kids by going through PGD. Because if they would have gone through PGD, the chances are he wouldn't be born. Some kids would rather not be born, but that's not the case. And therefore, when the parents are agonizing over the question to do IVF PGD or not to do IVF PGD, we have to be able to, to fully understand all the parameters, all the possibilities, and come to the best possible decision based on the general, on factors of the emotional state of the parents, of the guilt they may feel one way or the other, and so on and so forth. But that's an example of not a gray area. Another one is BRCA gene. BRCA gene is something also very, very sort of endemic to Ashkenazi Jewish communities. And it's a particular gene that in majority of cases, unfortunately, will end up with either breast cancer or ovarian cancer or both. There are two types of BRCA, BRCA1 and BRCA2. It's called BRCA. You can look at it. And it's something which a sort of disproportionate amount of members of Ashkenazi Jewish community have this particular gene. And when somebody is diagnosed with the gene, usually sometime before the age of 40, they have to be able to, and it depends on the doctor, what a doctor advises, either to do a double mastectomy, which means to do to remove both breasts, or to do a radical ovarian removal, which will send the woman into very, very sort of aggressive menopause immediately. And usually when a woman is diagnosed with BRCA, she's told she can have kids. She doesn't have to remove anything until late 30s, until maybe she's 40 years old or 39, something like that, because that's quite safe. It never usually actually comes out. And it's something that is complicated, because you really have to be able to, a lot of women don't want to live in fear, because it can come up very suddenly, very aggressively. With breast cancer, usually can monitor it better. With ovarian cancer, it comes up more aggressive and quicker, and so on and so forth. And a lot of women opt at the end of the day to do that particular surgery. Some of them, they want to wait longer. Right now, there's a method developed which allows for screening on a much more sophisticated level, and they catch it much quicker. There's also certain other options available to delay it. But nevertheless, it's something very, very serious. And the question came up. I was approached by a doctor here in Sydney called Dr. Leslie Andrews. And she approached me quite a number of years ago, and she said, look, she would like to make a awareness in the community for BRCA, to encourage women to be able to come and be tested. And actually, men can also have it, but with men, it'll be recessive. A man will not get breast ovarian cancer because a man has no ovaries, and a man also doesn't get breast cancer. But breast cancer is very, very rare. It is possible sometimes, but it's almost doesn't happen with men. The danger is with women. So I said to her, look, I'm happy to support the idea, but we should do it after they get married, unless you have a lady that is not planning to get married. But it's important for the same reasons I mentioned before to do it after they get married. The next question which I started to think about, and it's very debated among halachic authorities, there are two ways you can go about it. Let's say a lady gets married. So you make her aware of the BRCA situation. You can either tell her, listen, wait, don't get tested until, have as many kids as you want, and at the age of 38, go and get tested. That's one approach. And if, God forbid, she has it, then she would have to make a decision how to do it, which order to do it. but possibly to be able to do a double mastectomy together with ovaries removal. But then I thought to myself, another question. What about the possibility of letting them know earlier on, to give them the option to go through IVF PGD and to be able to single out the healthier embryos and put them in, and the unhealthy ones which are afflicted, not to put them in. And this way you'll be able to really eradicate the sickness from the family. And this particular concept it was actually a subject of a great debate among rabbis in authorities in Israel who deal with it, and some thought it wasn't justified to do PGD for that purpose, because there's so many maybes. There's a maybe if you're gonna get it. It's a maybe if if you, in other words, if a woman has it, it's not going to help her. It's only going to help the kids. So number one is maybe the kids won't have it. And if the kids will have the gene, maybe they won't actually have, in other words, in order to be able to actually sick with cancer, you won't know until the child is 38, until daughter is 38. So to try to preempt it and to be able to, there's also questions of how much you have to reveal, when a couple goes out, and meet each other for the purpose of marriage. Once the mother is diagnosed with BRCA, you have to reveal about the kids. They also may be diagnosed and so on and so forth. So there are many questions about it. Another question is, even if you do a PGD, are you allowed to eliminate all embryos with that particular gene, or only the female ones? And the male ones who are only carriers and who will never get sick, put them in, give them a chance to live. So my opinion was, and is still, that it's important to give that particular choice to a couple. Because ultimately, just to have that particular gene in the children is very traumatic. It's a very life-changing, possibly life-changing feature in one's life. And as far as whether or not you transfer only the unaffected embryos or also the affected male embryos, that depends a lot how many embryos there are altogether. So if, for example, there's 10 embryos that you can transfer, so it obviously makes more sense to put the totally healthy ones first. If there's only affected embryos and there's also some male ones, then it could be unfair not to transfer them at all, because ultimately they will not get sick. They only will be carriers, and then they can think about how to avoid it, when they grow up and everything else. So those are some of the issues that we face with PGD. There's a very wide gray area in the middle. There's a lot of things very, very simple that we not only allow, but we encourage. There's very obvious things we discourage and don't allow if somebody asks us. And there's a very, very large area in the middle that requires a lot of deliberation and a lot of halachic and medical advice. So this is the yes, and now if anybody has any questions.
Okay, we're going to start with some questions. I just wanted to mention before we start, as I've posted, we are now taking questions throughout the week as well. Anything that Rabbi Ulman has spoken about beforehand, any of the previous lectures, or if you have any ideas or topics that you would like to share with us or questions, you can send to info@rabbiulman.com. I posted it on the chat in the Zoom. That's info@rabbiulman.com. Please send your questions, and we will try our best to answer them. So some questions that came in throughout the week, and some of them are follow-up questions on previous lectures. Our first question is like this. During your second lecture, you mentioned that a lady raped by a non-Jew cannot marry a Kohen. What would be the law if she was raped by a Jew?
Okay. So that's, I think, my second lecture discussed all of the forbidden marriages for a Kohen, like a divorcee, a convert, and somebody that had a relationship with somebody she can't marry. The key point over here, it's not the rape or consensual relationship that makes a woman qualified or disqualified to marry a Kohen. It's the actual relationship. That's why I said before, it's not a question of any judgmental attitude towards anybody. And obviously somebody who was raped, it was through no fault of their own. So the answer is that if a woman was raped by a Jew, God forbid, she would be able to marry a Kohen, simply because it's only a relationship, whether consensual or not consensual, with somebody that she cannot marry, that disqualifies her to a Kohen. And the most common example, of course, is a non-Jew. So if a woman, for example, had a affair with a non-Jew, or was raped, as the example was given last time, she can't marry a Kohen. But if she had an affair with a Jew, she could. That's Gzeres HaKosov. It's actually a black and white law in the Bible and the Talmud. I want to say that another example, apart from a non-Jew, of somebody that she cannot marry, and therefore if she has a relationship, whether consensual or not consensual, and she can't marry a Kohen, is an example of a relative that she can't marry. Unfortunately, I had two cases that I dealt with, both from America, where I received a phone call from young ladies who, when they were young, they were raped by their brother, believe it or not. And the question now was, in the first particular case, she actually was going out with a Kohen, and she only discovered that he was a Kohen a day before he proposed to her. He was going to propose to her, and he said to her, look, I'm going to go to the cemetery to visit my grandfather. You know, it's a custom before you visit somebody, and I can't go to he's buried on the side, so I have to, always stand by the side because I can't go inside the cemetery because I'm a Kohen. And she found out he was a Kohen. And I received a phone call, and she was crying on the phone, and she told me that she has a something nobody knows about, only her and her mother. And when she was 9 years old, she was raped by a brother who she said was 11 years old. That was the first case. And she says that she must tell me, because in Jewish law you can't go shopping for halachic answers. So she said she asked a certain rabbi in Brooklyn, and the rabbi told her she must break off the shidduch. She has to break off that match, and she can't get engaged to him. And I asked, and I spoke to her and her mother. I said, did the rabbi ask any questions? And she said, no, I said, what did you tell him? She just told him that she was raped by a brother, and she says she must break off a shidduch. I said, look, if you didn't ask any questions, and we're dealing over here with laws of, it's life questions. When to break off an engagement, sometimes people don't recover from it. So it's not something that you can treat lightly. So I said, look, in this case, I'm allowed to, since he didn't ask any questions, I'll treat it as a mistaken answer, because you cannot answer something without knowing all the facts. So I asked, I told her, will she speak to me and tell me what happened? And at the end of the day, I allowed her to marry a Kohen on two grounds. Number one, I really don't believe that she was raped in the sense that what rape in Jewish law, that would make her invalid to a Kohen from a physical perspective. And the second thing is, there's a technical, I'll come to the second answer soon. I want to just tell you the second case I had a couple of years ago. Also, I received a call from a lady who told me that she has a sister-in-law next to her, and her sister-in-law already was, I think she was 17 years old, and she said also she was raped by her brother when she was young. And she asked me, in her case, she never went out yet, but she wants to know exactly what's her parameters. Can she, when they suggest to her boys, can she go out with a Kohen? And again, I spoke to her, and I actually wrote a tshuva, a halachic ruling, which also will be published. And I said on two grounds I'm going to allow her to marry a Kohen. Ground number one, I really don't believe in both cases they were raped. There was a proper penetration. That's number one. It just, I can tell from just by talking to them. But the second reason is that there's an interesting law in laws of testimonies, the separate part of Jewish law which talks about who's allowed to be a witness. And it says that a person cannot testify on something that happened. They can't testify when they're already mature adults about something that happened when they were minors. And the testimony cannot disqualify them. I differentiated between reporting abuse and being allowed to go to police and report the case. I don't know who they didn't give me the names of brothers. I think that if the brother was already, especially in the second case, when he was already older, he should be stopped. It's obviously some kind of a sickness or some kind of a terrible thing that could be repeated again. And therefore, my ruling that she's not believed that she was raped to disqualify her Kohen is not extended to the fact that she was molested and she was abused. And that is something is irrelevant whether she was raped according to Jewish law or not. And that's something which has to be reported. But as far as allowing her to a Kohen, in those cases, I've allowed it. And I always get, because we're talking about future generations, I always get at least two other colleagues who I respect and who I believe are experts in this area to co-sign with me, just to make it more accountable and a stronger psak. But in a situation where an adult lady was raped by a relative that she can't marry, she would not be able to marry a Kohen exactly the same way as a non-Jew who rapes a girl. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, next question. Before we go to the next question, I just want to remind everyone that you can sign up with the link that I posted on Zoom to receive future notifications on Rabbi Ulman's lectures. Okay, the next question is like this. Are there issues that Dor Yesharim does not catch?
Yes, Dor Yesharim has certain issues. I once dealt with Gaucher's disease, which they don't... Look, they purposefully don't go... They give a choice. The 10 main diseases, I think you can go up to 36. They don't go into every single... And they do it purposefully, not, it's not an oversight on their part. They intentionally don't want to go and try to be able to uncover every single possible type of a recessive genetic issue, because they only want to deal with the main ones. Again, they're not trying to play God and try to stop people from getting married left, right, and center. They want to be able to stop the main devastations of the diseases, some of them which were mentioned. But they definitely don't go... You could go into hundreds. There's no limit of how many diseases you can go into.
All right, next question. Is dismissing or destroying the embryos not used for implantation, but created in the IVF process, is it considered abortion or killing in Judaism? Okay,
look, the question is definitely discussed. I believe, and that's my opinion, an opinion of most consensus of most halachists and halachic authorities, is that there is a major difference between the embryo which already implanted in the uterus of the mother and outside of that. And there are many, many halachic differences. For example, you are permitted to break Shabbos to save a embryo or fetus once it's already implanted in the uterus of the mother, a potential mother, even though it's under 40 days. Under 40 days, it's something which is, it has much less of a status than after 40 days. But when it's still, in the incubator, it has a whole different status. You can't even break Shabbos to save it. And therefore, there's no obligation to be able to implant them. At the same time, part of our protocol is the way we dispose of them is different to the way we dispose of sperm and eggs. We dispose of them, of frozen sperm and eggs. We dispose of all of them under hashgacha, under supervision. While when it comes to sperm and eggs, we put something inside like alcohol or some kind of a material that will destroy them in order to assure that nobody will use them again. When it comes to embryos, it's a passive. We don't actually do anything. We just thaw the embryo. When you thaw the embryo, you don't kill it, because technically you could implant it still. And after you thaw it, you just let it stay there until it's not viable anymore. So I do agree with the question asked, that we still have a certain level of respect to life, even the way we dispose of it.
Okay, next question. Someone is asking, is PGD allowed with an adopted embryo?
Oh, you mean yes, it would be allowed. If for example, somebody, again, I'm not getting into a question whether one is allowed to take, I said last time that it's a very, very gray area about the whole concept of getting an egg donor. But once somebody got permission and they are using an egg donor, there's no reason why you can't do PGD. Once you're doing IVF anyway, PGD is allowed because you could screen for certain sicknesses. So PGD is allowed if you're doing IVF anyway.
Okay. Now we have some questions that are not directly related to today's topic but have come in. The first one is like this. If a doctor did a bris, does it mean anything?
Okay. One of the most sacred rites of passage for the Jewish people is circumcision as a bris milah. And for us it's not a operation, it's not just a surgical procedure, it's joining the covenant with our forefather Abraham and with the Jewish people from the beginning of our being. And therefore it is very, very important to understand that the only way that one can have a kosher bris that is considered to be a religious act is if one uses a certified kosher mohel. Here in Sydney, we have a number of mohelim that are licensed by the Beth Din. All of them are great specialists, both they're all religious people, they all know Jewish law, they all ask to make sure everything they do is within the boundaries of Jewish law, and they're also great specialists. They also can do circumcision 10 times better than any doctor, any non-secular urologist. I can tell you as somebody who is an expert in the area that you can't compare when unfortunately there is a perception among some people that they'd rather go to a urologist or to a pediatrician, some surgeon in the hospital to the bris. And unfortunately, as I'll explain in a second, the results are very, both religiously and practically, are very, very negative. This period of time of Corona, I was asked, and I actually recently wrote a tshuva on it, just to be able to keep it for posterity, because it's never happened before, such a problem. I was asked 5 questions from Asia. 4 questions, and all similar nature with one difference. 4 of them said as follows. A child was born, I was asked by rabbis, a child was born in all of those countries. The question was asked in Tokyo, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and China. And there's no mohel. The borders are closed. Nobody's allowed to enter those countries because of Corona. And they are stuck. They can't do a bris. So the family is asking, can we go to a secular doctor and do the circumcision? And afterwards, they heard about a concept of hatofas dam bris, when you can touch a needle and do a certain rectification by drawing a symbolic drop of blood and making it kosher. And I'm going to come to the 5th question later. It was a bit different. But to all of those questions, I said no, for the following reasons. Again, over here, I only have a couple of minutes to answer it, so I'm going to answer very shortly. But I've written about it quite extensively to be able to show all of the sources for my answer. The first answer is that one, halachically, everybody agrees that one cannot use a non-Jewish or a secular doctor to do a bris. You have to use a religious kosher mohel. To such an extent, even if it's going to be delayed for years. The only time that you can do it, if God forbid a person will die without it, then you can, that's the only time that you could do it without it. But otherwise, rather wait for, over here, they won't have to wait for years. We're talking about maybe a month or so. But it's very important to do a bris on the 8th day. It's no question about it. But it shows you how important it is not to go to a secular doctor. That's the first reason. The second reason, unfortunately, there is almost a plague exists in many countries, in Australia, America, Asia, where people really think and they're convinced that it's better to go to a secular doctor. And nothing could justify. Once you would allow it once, which was done with a rabbinical sanction, it would open the floodgates even more to be able to create a so to speak, some kind of a stamp of approval to continue to go for these doctors. And the last answer is very, very important. Anybody that is an expert in circumcisions knows that there's a major difference between they were done by even secular doctors in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the way it is done in the last 15, 20 years. I can tell that whenever somebody comes to the Beth Din to be converted, we ask them, part of the questions we ask them, are you circumcised? If they're not circumcised, we write it down in the case file, and towards the end of the process, they will have to go through a circumcision through a moil here in Sydney. We have the one who does the adults is Dr. Robinson, and two others to make a basin to have three kosher witnesses. One of them has to be from the Beth Din, and two others, and this will make the kosher for conversion. And afterwards, once they are circumcised, they can go through mikveh and everything else once they're healed. But if they tell us that they are already circumcised, because we learned by bitter experience, we always have a certain day when we actually check them. And I must tell you that invariably, about almost 100%, I would say maybe 98% of those that were circumcised back in the early years, the doctors must have had some, I don't know what technique they used in those days, but the end result is as good as a regular bris. Approximately, I would say 80% or more of brisin done in the last 10, 15 years, they have to be corrected. They're not kosher even to do a touch of a needle. And therefore, if that particular couple would take the child to a non-Jewish doctor, apart from the fact that it's forbidden, you probably would have to redo the bris anyway, because it wouldn't be done in the kosher way, and it wouldn't be suffice to touch with a needle. The fifth question was asked from Shanghai in China, that a couple whom I happen to know, I spoke both to the rabbi and to the couple involved. They had a baby boy, and over there they have a female doctor who says she can circumcise the child. Can you take it to a female doctor? And I'll tell you, my answer was that according to Jewish law you could, but in practice I didn't allow it. I'll explain to you why. There is an argument in the Talmud whether or not a woman can circumcise a child. And there's two opinions. One opinion says that because a woman herself, in order to circumcise, you have to be a male, because only somebody who has to be circumcised can circumcise others. For the same reason as a woman can't write tefillin, because she's not obligated to put on tefillin. But others say no, because Tzipporah, who was the wife of Moses, she was allowed to circumcise her child. Therefore, it shows that as long as you're Jewish and there's no males, you could do it. And the vast majority of the earlier commentators, all of them, the most famous one, Maimonides and Alfasi, the Rosh, the Tur, the Shulchan Aruch, they all say that in a situation where there's no men available, you can have a woman circumcised. There are a minority opinion that says that one shouldn't. But being that the overwhelming majority said that you could, certainly in a situation where you find yourself in a country where there's no male, you could use a woman. That's on the halachic level. On the practical level, I still wouldn't allow it, because unless I would know who is this woman, and actually I inquired and I was right. She trained with secular doctors. Once she trained with secular doctors, her technique and the results which she will produce will not be adequate, and you probably still would have to redo the bris. So on a practical level, I told the couple to wait, and hopefully in a couple of weeks we'll be able to do it. What was the other question? If you can... I forgot that the question was if... can you read out the question again?
Sorry, the same question?
Yeah.
So the question was, if a doctor did a bris, do you have to do it a second time? So
if a doctor did a bris, to answer the question in short, you would have to check it. If we were lucky and enough was cut and was done in a way that is physically kosher, would have to do a touch of a needle. But if he didn't cut enough, there's no other way, you would have to do a corrective bris. That's for tonight. And I want to thank everybody for coming, for joining us. Always a pleasure to see all of you. And I hope to see you next week. We'll announce the topic, but I would like to ask all of you to post questions, because this way I can make the actual talk a bit shorter and devote more times to questions.
I just want to end off by saying again, if you want to send questions, info@rabbiulman.com. We've run out of time over here. And if you would like to send questions anonymously, there is an option for that. If you go to chabadofbondi.com/classes, there is going to be an option. We're going to put it up tonight. There are some people that like to send questions anonymously, and that's okay. And we will put up the option tonight. So please forward your questions on any subject And yeah.
But even if you write the question not anonymously, we're not going to publicize who asked the question, but I don't mind knowing who asked the question. Questions are always good. I've never yet seen a bad question. There are bad answers, that's true, but there's never bad questions. So nobody should worry about asking questions, even if I know who you are. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a very, very good week, and we'll see you very, very soon.